Hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to Starship Troopers, Terran Command. This is the game that we're going to sort of do a quick review of, a little bit out of season, but here's the story, here's the setup. It's about to drop a DLC, I think next week in coming days. And I've got it, I've been playing it, I'm not actually under an embargo at the moment, so I can tell you the hour or so I've put into it, it's really good, alright? If you like the game originally, you're going to like the DLC, so stand by for that, but ultimately, I am going to review that DLC, so I thought I would brush up on the original Terran Command that came out in 2022, which I clocked, actually, off-channel, so I suppose I've got the authority to review it fully. I was only just going to play it for a couple of hours to get re-familiar, and then I spent my whole day and didn't do any work because this game is brilliant, and playing it again, it's still brilliant. So ultimately, if you are a Starship Troopers fan and somehow you don't know about this or you haven't played it, you should drop everything and go and play it. And if you're not a Starship Troopers fan, you should go away because it's the greatest movie of all time and I watch it every year. As far as my sort of little house rules go for price and value, it retails currently for $43.95 Australian. And I plug it into my spreadsheet and that tells me I should be getting 8.5 to 9 hours of solid gameplay at a minimum, to make it, you know, a reasonable exchange. And that's easily happened. I've got like 20 hours on the profile. Mind you, I've been replaying it a little bit and I've played a bit of the expansion, but even if you were generously going to say 15 hours all said, and replaying it, there's still plenty of value there. There's different difficulties, there's little sort of achievements per level, you know, kill X dudes with X abilities, that sort of thing. So yeah, look, it's absolutely worth your time. It's absolutely worth your money. Let's go into it a bit more. So at first blush, you would probably call it like an RTS, and I suppose you could say that, but it doesn't really have an economic back end, right? So it's closer to things like, oh my god, I'm gonna date myself here, like Ruse or War Game or even Steel Division in a way. There's not really an economic component to the strategic level of it. You do have it on a smaller scale, as in you capture these little bases and they can be used as call-in points, and you have a couple of different currencies like manpower, which goes against your unit. So if you want to call in another infantry unit, they'll cost like 3 pips. If you want to call in an engineer unit, smaller, close range, flamethrower, you know, hyper specific, that costs like 2 pips. And then you've got like radio officers and that you can call in, and that gives you mobile spawn points, things like that, and that'll cost you 1. So your currency never really blows out more than a couple dozen sort of thing. And then on top of that, you've got this sort of war effort, limited economy, which is used to upgrade and unlock higher tier units. Like for example, say you want to get snipers in, you have to buy the prerequisite building at your outpost with this war score, which also can be used to build things like turret emplacements and that, so they're limited by that currency. So essentially there's a handful of currencies that dictate what you can have on the table at any given time, but you're never going to get much more than a medium-sized blob. And the game eases you in fairly well, but as far as like blobbing behavior, it does sort of slap you on the wrist for that and forces you through its scenarios out of that. Manning the walls of defenses, protecting points because the bugs will come and they'll retake your little staging points, and now you can't spawn from that point anymore. So there is this interplay, there is a dynamic component. However, setting a unit in a specific spot that can hold like checkpoints and maneuvering around that, sort of more, not static, but sensible, considered placement. There are times where you can just roll the blob with the tack move, but ultimately, while you're essentially fighting on one front, I know I'm talking broadly, but there's so many different scenarios that cover different things. It is difficult to be too broad, but often you will get a sandbox style map and your enemies are going to keep attacking and probing from different angles. So while you're trying to progress the objective with your attack front blob, let's say, you can't really neglect the other angles, and you have to figure out if you're going to station units there to hold down a wall, and there's elevations a component, line of sight, units can't shoot through each other, so you have to play around that, or, you know, build emplacements and that sort of thing. So there is that dynamic component of pushing forward and through the objective, whilst also maintaining your defenses of ground already taken. So that's sort of a core part of the loop. A core part of the mechanic of how the baddies work is they have hives around the map, and they'll have little, you might see it in the video, but so essentially what happens is that this hive will, over time, it will fill a bar up that you can see. And once it fills all the way up, it starts again, and that adds a pip worth of, like a wave of enemies that can come out. And if you go up to it to try and deal with it, it's going to spit that wave out and exhaust it. So what you kind of have to do is drain the hive of its reinforcements, exhaust it. But you do have to do it within a certain window, because if, say, you go up there and you have a huge battle of attrition, you lose a bunch of dudes, they lose a bunch of bugs, you drain out the hive, but you don't quite finish it. You don't, because when it is totally empty, you need to send a unit in to kill everything in the hive and finally destroy it for real. If you don't commit to that and you fall back, chances are, while you're getting your units back, which is kind of throttled by dropship availability, there's a cooldown on the dropships bringing dudes in, then the aliens are going to just reset their bug reinforcements back to the beginning. So just brute forcing it often gets you into trouble, has your entire army wiped, but at the zero-sum cost of they have their army wiped, you have your army wiped, and then when you build yours back up, they build theirs back up as well. So you have to actually be sensitive, set up firing arcs and advance on them. So for a game that at first blush seems simpler than what you might be expecting from an RTS with a huge logistics chain component to it, there is actually some very sensible interplay and kind of counterplay with how you go about eliminating the bug hives. So look, those are the sort of broad moving parts. However, there is a loose narrative of going through this Kwalasha planet and doing these different missions, but the mission scenarios are all quite brilliant and quite varied. An example that comes to mind is, I love Starship Troopers, a prison ship has crashed, but the dude on the prison ship he's a leader of the minor union rebellion. So fucking scum. You can't have him living in the Starship Troopers universe, right? So he's the epitome of everything, and he was being transported to be executed live at 6, all channels on bloody FedNet. So very much throwback to the movie. And so this dude's thing has crashed in bug territory. So we're sending an entire battalion in there to rescue this dude, bring him back to a prison, defend waves until we can get the the network up and running to broadcast this dude's death to the rest of the Federation on a matter of principle. And honestly, that just tickles me, and so many missions do. Like, I don't want to spoil or anything like that, you know. There's a lot of missions that have that sort of theme to it, so they absolutely nail the Starship Troopers theme, basically. Speaking of theme, they have a lot of cool hand-drawn cutscene still sort of things, and they're voiced over by this dude, and it's so tongue-in-cheek and very much in the vein of Verhoeven's movie version as well. You know, very tongue-in-cheek satire. Very, very cool. It's war effort for the war effort. Let's get those miners into the mines. You know, this sort of thing. And the soundtrack, which is wild, by the way. Basil Papadoulis, if however you pronounce it, who did other great soundtracks like RoboCop, you know, Hunt for Red October. I think he's actually my personal favorite composer of music scores. But that really memorable Starship Troopers theme song is absent from the game, presumably because of his estate holding rights or whatever, but it cannot be understated. Like, when I heard that really upset me, because I think it's such a brilliant theme. But the music, the composer who has gone and captured the feel, the general vibe, all the overtures, the swell, this feels like a sequel soundtrack in a way. That it takes everything that made the original soundtrack brilliant, and it does a new theme that is so clearly a love letter successfully to the previous soundtrack that I absolutely love this. But yeah, the soundtrack is absolutely brilliant, and take it that from someone who was miffed that they didn't actually have the original song in the soundtrack, yet in a way, I'm kind of glad that they went this direction, you know? didn't know I wanted it until they gave it to me. Anyway, as far as, there are some sort of like little extra scenarios, but there is replayability in the difficulty settings. It's mostly just your weapons do less damage. There's a lot of cool different bug types that get introduced, so there's an escalation component as you go through it. Ones, you know, I don't want to ruin it, ones you've seen in the movie and some other twists, and also some tech that you probably know of from like, even like the book, you know, like your sort of mech warrior power armor suit things come into play as well. So by the end of the game, the power creep is really pushed right up, and there's a pretty epic finale if I recall correctly, even though I haven't played all the way through this particular time around. So yeah, game's brilliant. There's a lot of value in there. If you're a fan of Starship Troopers, it's an absolute no-brainer. Stand by for me to put a review up for the DLC. I'm not sure if I'm going to put it up early or if I'm just going to sort of wait for release day and aim for that. Again, like I said, I'm not embargoed. They've been pretty loose with it, but it is one of those things, a little bit of inside baseball. As I work out how I do these sort of off-the-cuff reviews, how do I go about doing DLC, right? Because I don't necessarily clock a whole lot of games, and under this model, the idea is, you know, I want to play the appropriate value amount and judge it on that appropriately, you know. So then you get yourself in a scenario, well, this is a good example. The DLC is a second campaign. Different planet, it's like a lava planet, different settings, you have a bit of a sneak peek, right? It would benefit greatly to have covered the first game in its entirety to be sort of up to speed before you go reviewing the DLC. Other examples are, like, at the moment, I have the Dead Island 2 House DLC, which doesn't unlock until you clock the entire game. So that I'd have to go back and play that for like 20, 30 hours before I could really give that a crack as well. Another one's Vagris. Vagris, you know, 10 hours of that you have to play before the new DLC unlocks. So I'm sitting on all this DLC, but I'm still trying to figure out how best to cover it on the channel. So it might be one of those things that won't come out super timely generally, and it will only come out if it's a game that I love enough to play to completion off channel. Anyway, well, like I said, a little bit behind the curtain, give you an idea of what's rolling around inside my head, not much. But in all seriousness, I do need to come up with a system for how I cover DLC if I'm going to cover it at all. Anyway, Starship Troopers, Terran Command. Pick it up, full price. It's absolutely worth full price, and it still holds up, what, a year and a half later? Brilliant game, and like I said, I lost my weekend playing it when I was only just going to check in for an hour or something like that. Anyway, team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.